Okay, so today you see the same title page as last time, which means that there is a continuity with the previous lecture. We are basically going to ask exactly the same question, why are tropical rainforests so rich in tree species? And we will go through all the other answers except for Jens and Connell, which we have already done. So with this, we can look at the review of Joe Wright, which is almost 20 years old now, entitled Plant Diversity in Tropical Forests, a review of mechanisms of species coexistence. But these basic considerations are pretty much the same. There hasn't been any major new explanation in 20 years, although there has been quite a bit of new data and better understanding of the importance of these factors. These are theoretical suggestions what might be happening, but I can make a spoiler here and tell you that each of them does have some relevance and some impact, at least in some situations. And so they all together, plus the Jens and Connell, create a series of mechanisms which somehow end up defining high tropical forest diversity, which of course is typical for ecology, but also not very convenient, that we never seem to be able to make a clear-cut decision that this mechanisms is responsible for the pattern and this one is simply false. Unless you have some really implausible mechanism, then usually you find out that at least in some circumstances there is certain truth to these reasonable suggestions. So which are as follows. First, we are talking about different species limited by different resource or their combination. It's a classical niche differentiation. Species are coexisting simply because they have different niches and therefore their competition is reduced. Second option is that the species may not have the same niches, but the direction of the competition is changing either over space or time. So that means that there is not a uniform situation where a species will go extinct because either it has some space refugia where it's protected from a competition, or even the competitive advantage can change with changing conditions over time. Another option is that there is a competition, it's happening, but it's going on too slowly. And so what we are seeing is actually that this is a community which is not in equilibrium, that it's heading towards excluding somebody, excluding one or few species, but too slowly. So we don't actually see it yet. And then there is immigration, so-called mass effect, which means that yes, the species are being excluded, but unsuccessfully because new individuals, typically seeds, are arriving all the time. So although they are destined to exclusion, then if you have a sufficiently strong input of seeds or other immigrants, then the species still maintain their presence in the system. And then finally, so-called recruitment limitation. So that means that no matter what will be the result of the competition never happens because the two potentially competing species never meet frequently enough to even try to decide which one is competitively superior. And finally, we have the negative density dependence factor, which we have already discussed in detail. So I will go one factor by one. So let's start with niches. This is the reminder of species diversity in larger plots in local tropical forest communities, which is these plots are in green, and you can see that typically when we think of broad range, we can say that there are somewhere between 100 and 1,000 tree species in a local community. So that means that to justify their coexistence, we would have to think of between 100 and 1,000 different niches. Okay, how can we do that? Well, we can think of ecological gradients, for instance, in light, and how they are partitioned. Yeah, you can have a gradient which offers a lot of different niches, which can be partitioned very finely. This is, for instance, situation for herbivorous insects. We rarely ask the same questions for herbivores as we ask now for plants, why there are so many species coexisting, simply because for them it's very easy to get separated by different host range. And so that's an example of a niche which has huge potential for division. But when it comes to trees and their nutrients and sunlight and water, we don't have such a fine participation. So let's say here we can say that maybe there are 3 different distinct states, low light, medium light, or high light. So that's one dimension. Okay, there can be second one, let's say topography, the small scale topography within community. We can have little valleys, slopes, ridges, and with different conditions, maybe different soils, so they can host different species. Okay, so combination of these 2 dimensions, each with 3 different states, you will get 9 niches. So we are still very far from even 100, but the beauty of the system is that every added dimension will radically increase the number of niches. So if we add the 3rd dimension, then suddenly we have 27 species instead of 9, because each of these 9 will get extra 3 different levels based on these, whatever is the red ecological dimension here, again with 3 different values. So if we continue like that, then actually, if we can think of 6 ecological dimensions like that, each of them with 3 different values, then we already get 3 to the power of 6, which is 729 species explained. So we are basically there. So 6 niches is 6 dimensions is not such a large number. However, this is really a very theoretical example, because it assumes that species will be limited to each state, or at least can survive when limited to each of the 3 states on each of the 6 gradients. And then even more, with more difficulty, these have to be independent. So they have to vary independently, and all the combinations, all 729 combinations, have to be present in sufficient volume in the environment, so it can support a species. And especially this independence of gradients is very tricky, because just look at the topography and light we had. Of course, you can say that maybe there is more light at the ridge, and there is more shade in the valley, and you already have a correlation. Of course, very often you will have a correlation with humidity, with water supply, and topography. And light will, of course, be correlated with temperature. And so it's actually quite difficult to think of a system like that, which would support hundreds of species locally. So we don't actually think this is the case, but there is some niche separation, and we can have a look at some examples. This is a dipterocarp genus Shorea with multiple species in Sri Lanka.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes.
About the previous slide, why the species area relationship here seems linear, and we usually study with with the SUSPA that is not like that. Can you explain that?
Yes, a good question. Because this graph is on logarithmic scales. Yeah, you can see that the area starts in 10 hectares and goes to 100 on log scale. And the same is for the number of species, 110, 100, 1000. So this is double logarithmic. And so that will indeed convert the species accumulation curve. Also, this is not exactly species accumulation curve. These are individual locations, often on different continents. Yeah, so this is not a typical species accumulation within a single community. But you are right. You would still expect non-linear relationship, and you will get it if we use the arithmetic scales on the graph.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this is the three-dimensional system for the Shorea. It's a bit of a cheating. I couldn't find better examples. So there is altitude from 0 to 2,000 meters. So obviously we are no longer in a single community, strictly speaking. But as an example, you can use it. So this is the gradient in light, and individual species are shown with their preferences. Okay. The same goes for soil moisture, and then on the side of the cube you see the elevations. And so, for instance, when you look at the cube from above, which is shown here, then you have basically their overlaps in 2 dimensions. That means between soil and light. And then there is a third dimension which separates them by altitude. But as you can see here, most of the species are lowland. So there is a huge overlap in the lowland, and only the species B is completely separated, almost completely separated from others as the high altitude one. So yes, there can be some separation. This is a one-dimensional example from local community. Still staying with Shorea species, because that's a favorite model, because there are usually many species coexisting. This is Dipterocarpaceae that's specific for Southeast Asian forests, especially Borneo, but also elsewhere. This is in location Lambir Hills, which is indeed in Borneo. It's a lowland forest. You can see a picture from there. On the horizon, you can see a canopy crane. Yeah, that's a crane standing in the forest, which brings scientists to the canopy, because that's especially useful in dipterocarps, which are one of the tallest tropical forests. So there is a mosaic in that one location. There is a mosaic of 4 different soils: sandy loam, loam, fine loam, and clay. And this is basically a gradient with increasing fertility and moisture. So sandy loams are dry and nutrient poor as opposed to clay. And these are examples showing soil specialists. This is again 50-hectare plot with different elevations, and with also different soil types. So the soil types are in color here, and you can see the distribution of individual species. So sandy loam specialist is here, Shorea acuta, then Amplexicaulos as well. Then we have fine loam, Xanthophylla. Everything is in sort of middle green, and then there is an example of a generalist which is pretty much everywhere. Doesn't really care about soil. This is again the same location, the same soil types, but in this case, this is the community composition of all dipterocarp species there, not only Shorea. So this is the average community values for 80 species which are there from the same family, and it's exploring not species composition but ecological traits. So these are the community averages across the 80 species present for sub-communities on different soil types. And again, this is relative growth rate. This is seed mass, leaf toughness, specific leaf area, that is the area per 1 gram of leaf biomass. So large values means thin, light leaves. This is leaf size, and finally the nitrogen concentration in the leaf tissue. First, most of the traits are actually quite different between soils. So you get not only individual species preferences, but also ecologically slightly different communities, which is interesting because they are in a mosaic in one place. And secondly, again, even with the community traits, they are certainly not independent. You can see that there are suites of traits which are moving in the same direction. So relative growth rates goes steadily down. The same go specific leaf area, and then nitrogen concentration, while leaf toughness move in opposite direction. So these are typical life history syndromes. So you have species which are rapidly growing. These typically have a thin sort of not very heavily built leaves. That's part of why they are so rapidly growing, that they have a very efficient photosynthesis with little biomass investment. You have a big leaf. That means these leaves can be tough if they are thin and sort of built very sparingly, and because there is a large nitrogen concentration, then that's one of the reasons why they grow fast. And not surprisingly, we are talking about the clay, which is the most fertile and humid soil. And then you go in a steady direction towards the poorest soil. Okay, but these soil preferences look simple, and they are simple, but they are sometimes quite difficult to explain. This is an example from again different location in Borneo. Again, looking at Shorea. Again, looking at soil. This time there are two types of soil: mudstone and alluvial. And again, you can see the alluvial soils are in dark here, and mudstones are in white in a large plant plot. And so they were looking at again traits of species, and this is, for instance, growth rate between alluvial and mudstone soils for each of the Shorea species. Okay, they actually did reciprocal seedling transplants. So you have seedlings which you transplant between soils. Of course, you also transplant control ones to the same type of soil, and then you see what they are doing. And this is quite boring result. Basically, it shows that universally relative growth rate is slower at mudstones for all species pretty much, but it doesn't really explain any coexistence because the species behave the same. You rarely see these lines crossing. There is one example here when it's crossing. So that means that the hierarchy in growth is changing. So for instance, here, when you look at these two species, the one in orange, it has a disadvantage at alluvial over the species, and then, however, it has advantage in mudstone. So this would be an example where separation to soil can explain their competition results because they have different competitive hierarchies on different soil. But that's a rare case. This is the growth in gaps, and this is the growth in understory, pretty much the same. Of course, the growth tends to be slower in the understory, but again, no real changes in competitive hierarchies. So growth rate doesn't explain much here. This is the survivorship. So this is how, when you start from 100% of seedlings, and you watch them over time, 25 months in this case, then you see how fast they are dying. And these curves are for individual species again, different soil types, and either gap or understory. Okay, seedlings are generally doing better in gaps than understory, no surprise here. But again, for instance, these highlighted species, Shorea argentifolia, it's a mudstone specialist only in white areas, but you can't really tell from survivorship. You would expect that that would be especially favorable habitat, but when you look at mudstone, the trees are pretty much dying. Yes, they are dying a little bit less here on mudstone understory than in alluvial understory. That's true. They are also surviving slightly better in mudstone gap than alluvial gap, although that's true for most of the species. But there are no real, clear explanation why we see this kind of changes. We clearly did not measure the right parameters here. You can measure lots of things, and some of them might show to be really important. Okay, now we are getting to topography. This is our 50-hectare plot in Vanang with topographical system. When we were choosing 50 hectares, we were purposefully look at really variable topography so that we can see what influence it has. So this is a bit of a ridge which is coming through the plot. Maximum height is 180 meters, and in this valley the minimum height is 90 meters. So you have very decent change across a short distance. And this is, for instance, a distribution of one canopy tree, Pomezia pinnata. Here you have a picture. It has actually edible fruits. It's one of the few rainforest species which have a very nice fruit. Okay, so when I flip the topography and the distribution, you already see that the species is basically avoiding the red. That means topographically high area. So it doesn't like reach. Yeah, of course we can do statistical analysis, but it's fairly clear. Okay, when we go to another species, Insia bijuga, that's a very valuable timber species. You see different patterns. You see that it's on the steep slopes, yeah, where the contour lines are dense. So again, that's sort of yellowish color. Yeah, so that's a very different distribution. Okay. This is a bit more systematic look. That's a 25-hectare plot in Yasuni National Park. These few locations I am starting to talk about, you will hear about them throughout the whole semester, because there are not so many well-established tropical study sites which are used to generate most of the data. So, once you do tropical ecology a few years, and once you visit all these classical sites, then when you read a new paper, you already know the place. In extreme cases, you can even know individual trees which they are talking about if you are really familiar with the place. So this is in the Amazon a lowland area, which again is geographically rugged, geographically variable. So there is a valley in blue, and then there are hills, and they were divided into these different sections, from the ridge top in yellow to some different types of slopes. And these are distribution of several species, just to show different types of distribution. So you can see that, for instance, this species is extremely shy of the valley. It will simply not grow there, although it's extremely dense on the hills. This tree doesn't care about anything regarding topography, and so on and so on. You can different patterns. But when we want to get the importance of topography, we need actually to do some systematic survey. So these are all the common trees in the plot, and this is what's the density in valley, and then compared with the upper slope. So it's basically the blue against brown, and the more common species is, the more significant results you get, of course, with certain level of preference. So the significant differences are in blue. So all the blue species, even not limited completely to one of the topographical feature, they show significant preference for one or the other. Yeah, those below here, they like upper slope better, and then these above like valley better. The red ones are not significantly different from random distribution. which of course is effect of sample size. If you have small sample size, everything seems to be random. Okay, this is the same study for contrasting lower and upper slope. So not surprisingly, there is more indiscriminate species between these two features. Okay, so we were looking at the topographical features and their niche, sort of as a niche dimensions. Now I will divert a little bit to slightly different topic, simply because you already are familiar with the location, with the topography, and with the trees, and so I will illustrate one very interesting approach to study community patterns on the same plot. This is again the plot, and what they did is that they used 20 × 20 meter squares. You can see them here in the picture, and for each of them, they look at what species of trees are there, and then they measured their specific leaf area as an ecological feature, and did community average, precisely as we did for different soil types in the previous study. And they found that there is actually a big habitat difference again. So it's not only between soil types, but there is also a difference between topographic features, which of course might be also connected to some degree with different soils. So that trees with low specific leaf area are mostly on the ridges. Yeah, you have a scale here. So the low values are violet, and then the higher are blue. And so the higher specific leaf area is on the valley. So these are also, we can speculate based on what you already saw, that these are also faster growing species, maybe with higher nitrogen content and so on. Okay, so yes, nothing really strange. This is so-called habitat filtering. That means that the habitats have certain requirements or conditions, and so they have only certain type of species growing there, either certain species or certain ecology growing there. So in this case, this is certain ecology specific leaf area. Okay, but then the next step is interesting, because yes, different habitats can have different requirements like that, but what about what happens within the habitat? There you can argue that what is advantageous for species is if even related species, which you would normally expect to be ecologically similar, if they diversify. If every species is different, so that means that every neighbor is different, and that can be advantageous. It can be advantageous to use different resources if they have different requirements for nutrients, for instance, or if they are protecting themselves against herbivores, then if they are very different in how they protect themselves, then again, herbivore can't really jump easily from one species to another. Species can't get infected from their neighbors. So there is a suggestion that one coexisting effect might be also the maximizing diversity of typically coexisting species. And so they tested that. They were looking at whether within the same habitat, the species which are closely together, that means in the same 20 × 20 meter plot, whether their diversity of specific leaf area is what you would expect randomly from within the same habitat, or whether they are selected for close coexistence so that they have either less diverse or more diverse values of specific leaf area. And this is the result. This is for each quadrat, you have 1 point here in the space of quadrat species richness. So this is how many species was there. And this is what was the range of specific leaf area. That means from the minimum to maximum. And of course, that range will increase with the number of species. The more species you have, the more likely you have extreme values. What they did is they compared the measured value, which is averaged here by this full line, with the random selection for the same number of species you could expect. And so that's your null hypothesis. And the value was significantly higher. So that means that the range is bigger. And so that means that yes, the 20 times 20 meter subsets of communities are non-randomly more diverse in terms of specific leaf area than you would expect. So that's a indirect but interesting pointer to diversifying as a way of a better coexistence. Okay, now after this interesting study, we go back to more boring stuff again, and this time we are back in Yasuni, and we have 16 species of Myristicaceae. They are from 4 genera. You can see them here: Virola, 10 species, and then the other genera. And they were again looking their distribution, but in this case, and that's why I'm showing this here, they were looking at combination of 2 factors. One was topography again, and another was light availability. Light availability was classified by 5 degrees. So this is example of 5 stages along the gradient. And the topography was you have it here, 4 different stages: ridges, slopes, valleys, and then there were species which were indiscriminate. So you had 3 different topography features and 4 groups of species. So ridge specialists are yellow, slope specialists is blue, and then green are valley specialists, and indifferent species are in gray. And then for each species, you have distribution according to the light. And so you can see again that species are very imperfectly separating, even when you look at the phylogenetically related species. Yeah, you have basically most of the species like middle levels of light. And so when you look at species which are not separated, they are framed in the same red frame here. So you can frame the top 2 yellow species into one group. Then you have some separation. There are 3 green species here. They all have pretty much same light. This one could be separated because it's mostly in the stage 2. And then there is a big group of indifferent species topographically, which also like middle light. So again, imperfect separation. Okay, so I think that's enough about niche differentiation. Now we go to potentially changing selection pressures due to temporal or spatial variability, and then also in sufficient time for competitive exclusion, we will do it at the same time. Okay, this is a trivial example. This is an aerial picture from New Guinea. You already see that you can say this is a species coexistence, but you can also say that that's a not very interesting explanation because this looks like 2 different habitats, and of course you have 2 different species there. Sorry, 2 different set of species there. Okay, now another issue here is the disturbance, and that can change selection pressures, and that can also slow down competition, because it's basically sort of, as the name says, is disturbing species from their daily business because it's affecting them, and so they can't really get into the business of competing with one another fast enough. And so let's look at the disturbance. This is a bit overlapping with our next lecture next week, which will be about ecological succession, but that's another matter. So for the disturbance, they can have 2 effects. One is that if disturbance removes the vegetation, it creates successional series, which is basically new habitat with new suite of species, which of course add to the diversity of the whole system. Okay, but then there is also second option, and that is that it removes individuals from the field, and that means it throws back the process of ongoing exclusion by competition to earlier stages. So we will go to one by one to the 2 factors here. For the effect of disturbance, creating new habitats and new successional stages, there is so-called intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which basically says that the highest diversity will be expected where you have a mid-level of disturbance, not too low, not too high. If it's too low, you are missing these early successional stages in the ecosystem with the specialist species they have. If too high, your primary forest is reduced and therefore not so many species in favor of the secondary forest. That means successional stages. Okay, this is a bit of a trivial hypothesis. You can say, you know, intermediate level of anything is best for ecology. You know, you of course that's a bit of trivial, but anyway, we can explore it. And there has been a review in 2009 in Ecology Lectures, and it already gives away the result in the title very nicely, because it says the intermediate disturbance hypothesis applies to tropical forests, but disturbance contributes little to tree diversity. So they did find effect significant, but at the same time of very low importance. They put together a very impressive set of 2,500 1-hectare plots of tropical vegetation. So that's really an achievement. Classified each of them by disturbance index. And then that means how intensely they were disturbed. And then they looked at species density, basically number of species per hectare. And this is the result. So you would expect that there will be a peak in the middle. And, you know, if you really look carefully and if you like the hypothesis, you might actually see it there. But it's not a real peak. Okay, why is that? Well, because you have nothing in the wet forests, you have a very little in moist, and it's only dry forests which look promising. And so this is actually the conclusion, that, you know, dry forests are driving the overall effect, which is extremely small. Okay, now when we are talking about primary forest and successional stages, this is just an example how it looks like. This is again from lowland rainforest in Vanang in Papua New Guinea. Top is primary forest, 1 hectare. This is the species composition based on plant genera and grouped into families and higher taxa, with the size of the block corresponds to the abundance of the tree. This is the same done for the secondary forest, which is, you know, it's not an initial stage. It's a very solid forest, 25 meters high. You can see it here. But first, you already see there are fewer genera and also species, and also that some of the genera are quite dominant. Macaranga here, ficus here, Trichospermum. That doesn't happen in primary forest. So when we look at these two hectares, we actually surveyed them in detail, and these are all the trees above 5 centimeter dBH from both hectares. And then what we have done, my colleague Ontrakaman did these simulations. You can actually create these different level of disturbance in computer. You have the solid primary forest 1 hectare. You can divide it into 20 times 20 meter plots, and then you can play with it by cutting the secondary forest squares and bringing them to the primary forest in different numbers, either dispersed like this or in one large disturbance increasing. And then you can calculate what's happening with the actual combined community. Because secondary forest has a small number of stems, small leaf area and leaf biomass, then as you, of course, you randomize these additions, you know, every degree you randomize number of times. And so when you are getting from fully primary forest to the fully secondary, there is a steady decline in number of stems, leaf area and leaf biomass. But what is interesting is what's happening to species. When we look at the species diversity in Okay, so we will be looking at a number of species from fully primary forest with increasing share of the secondary. So again, basically what intermediate disturbance is telling you is that there should be a peak, and there is a very small peak, very small increase over the pure primary forest, which is this dotted line, for about 20% of the secondary forest. Okay, but much bigger effect is when you measure the diversity not per hectare, but per number of stems of trees. There, which is also a legitimate way of measuring diversity. There you actually have a significant increase. So there the mid disturbance effect is visible, and it's about 1/3 of the forest getting disturbed is sort of ideal for maximizing diversity. When you go lower, you are missing secondary species. When you go higher, then too much of secondary forest is bad for your diversity, because secondary forest is less diverse than the primary one. Okay, now, since we are talking about this successional dynamics, we can ask a seemingly childish, trivial question, which is actually quite interesting, and that is why there is actually forest succession. No, it's not self-obvious. If you have a continuous primary forest, and if you have some disturbance, like a big tree dies and falls down, or there is a landslide, and you have a clearance, then logically you would expect that the same primary forest species will actually grow back in that new space, because all trees around you are primary forest trees, and they are producing huge numbers of seeds. So some of them will grow, and some of them will restore the primary forest. So forest succession is actually a very unexpected phenomenon. We are of course used to it, but and don't even think about these questions. Why it is there? But it's a legitimate question. That's simply because the rightful place of the primary forest species to in that forest, which they would of course fill if you prevent intruders, if you prevent secondary forest species from reaching that new place, that tree gap or landslide place, then yes, there will be no succession, because the primary forest species will be perfectly able to take the place and grow back. But that never happens, because there is a group of species which are specializing on very fast colonization of these favorable places. Favorable because suddenly there is a lot of sunlight, and growing faster than the primary forest species. So they will be winning in the competition with these primary forest species, and they will create secondary forest there. Okay. That happens. So then we can ask, okay, once this happens, why the secondary forests don't stay there forever? Why there is finally succession, that means replacement to primary forest? Well, the problem is that if you are really evolutionary, single-mindedly specialized on growing fast, then there are some negative effects of that. And that is that then if you are growing fast under full sunlight, your photosynthesis is set up in such a way that it's poorly surviving in the shade. And so secondary forest trees actually have seedlings and saplings which can't survive even in their own shade. So once they're in secondary forest, even though they produce a lot of seeds, they fall down, they will not be able to grow under the shade of their parents. And that's why there is only these forests typically are one generational, and then that provides opportunity finally to the primary forest to replace them. Okay, why is that? This is a perfect example of so-called trade-off. Yeah, so basically you can't optimize all performance parameters. You can't have car which is go extremely fast and at the same time is very economic with fuel. Yeah, you have either one or the other, and that's exactly how the trade-off you have for photosynthesis. You can either have photosynthesis, which is very fast when there is a lot of light, but then it has real problems where there is not enough of light. Or you can have a very efficient photosynthesis like primary species have, but that you can't really crank it up and you can't get it faster when suddenly there is a lot of light. That trade-off is illustrated here in this picture, which is one of the sort of key graphs from the whole Tropical Ecology course. That is that there is a negative correlation. Between the ability of survive in poor light condition and ability to grow fast. So this is the maximum growth rate in good conditions. That means it's in forest gaps. And this is the mortality in shade. And so, of course, the low mortality is good, but you can see that low mortality is there only for the species which have low growth rate. And then those species which grow fast are inevitably having a high mortality rate, which, as you can see, can reach almost 100%. Yeah, so so you have this relationship, and then you have two blank areas in this graph. Yeah, you have this one, which is not surprising because these are loser trees. You know, if some species is dying in the shade and growing slow in the sun, there are really not many places where it will survive. So there are no trees like that. This would be, of course, very desirable if we had some points here among super trees which can survive in shade and grow very fast. They will really have the power to stop ecological succession. But again, they are evolutionary impossible. Okay, this plot is from Barrow, Colorado Island. So that's one location, and it's about 30 years old. Okay, but then more recently we have an update. Yeah, from this plot we go to this one, which was published actually this year in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, and it's coming from Barrow, Colorado again, which is the yellow regression here, but also from 9 other forests. They all are these forest geo plots. Here also the parameters are slightly different. This is data which are based on 3 surveys spaced by 5 years. And so you have 2 growth rates, each measured for 5 years. So this is much more solid. And so this is the maximum growth rate here. And on the y-axis is species mortality at 0 growth rate. You can extrapolate it if you have data. So again, mortality at 0 growth rate is basically poor light condition. So again, it's the same thing. And so you have, of course, more species. This is more than 1,000 species of trees. And again, these evolutionary impossible species are still not here. So we still have rainforest succession, although they were able actually to find some loser trees. Maybe they are having bad year. Maybe they like to change later. We don't know. Okay, so if we conceptualize this is basically what I just explained. This is just nicely put in the conceptual graph. We can also look at this trade-off, not between 3 species, but we can also look at it for individuals in different conditions for the same tree species. So here we again have a growth rate against mortality, and there can be different responses between species. There can be species which don't really have a flexibility in allocation strategy, whether they go for faster growth or higher survival. They are always the same. They don't respond much to environment. They just grow in the environment which is right for them, and it changes a problem. or there are more flexible species which can have different policies depending on where they happen to be. Okay, these are examples. So this is Cecropia insignis. That's a neotropical pioneer species, early secondary, and it's very flexible. You can see that there can be a range of growth rates. Each circle is one individual, and then that of course is correlated also with mortality. So this is probability of mortality. So that means fast-growing species. Fast-growing species are dying fast than the more careful, slowly growing species. This is Dilenia retusa. That's a species which does basically nothing. It's always very tolerant to shade, and it's always very slowly growing, no matter what happens. Okay, and so we can look at different strategies. The paper actually classify them into 4. Intolerant, meaning intolerant of shade. So intolerant of shade, unresponsive. So these are species which are always growing fast and always dying in the shade. Intolerant responsive, that's what we saw in Cecropia. They are flexible, but generally can't survive in shade. Tolerant unresponsive and tolerant responsive. And when you classify different species, then not surprisingly, forests with larger disturbance intensity have completely different distribution of strategies than forests with smaller disturbance intensity. So large disturbance intensity is dominated by early successional species which are intolerant. Okay, now a brief illustration of the other principle that disturbance is not necessarily about introducing pioneer species. It can also be about slowing the exclusion process in competition between 2 even primary forest species. So very simple illustrative example, perhaps too simple. If we have in a forest, if we have 2 species competing against each other, A and B, every year the annual cover of A increases 10%, and it's not affected by species B at all. It's very asymmetric competition, and species A is winning. Species B can have a cover increase 5% every year, but if it comes to competing with A, then A always wins. Okay, under no disturbance, when we start with the equal cover of both species, not surprisingly, it doesn't take long when the B species is excluded. Yeah, it grows slower, and then when it comes to shortage of space after the generation 7, then it's out competed. However, if we keep these rules but only introduce that every year 15% of vegetation is randomly destroyed, that means in the proportion that the 2 species are present, then the same process goes again, but it's thrown back every 5 years, every 4 years. And so after 15 years, the species B is still very decently there. And so the whole process will go longer. It's fairly logical, but the question is whether it actually works in reality as well. This is example of such disturbance. Yeah, you can see my colleague George Weiblen here for scale. And this is again from New Guinea lowland forest in Wanang, and this is a natural landslide. Even in the lowland forest, you don't have to have huge mountains to do that, and so you can see that's completely random destruction of all the biomass there in the proportion of how it occurs in the forest. So it's nicely modeling the mechanisms which I showed you. Now, how important is disturbance in tropical forests? Some people might think of majestic tropical forests being always there, very stable ecosystems, ancient trees. That's actually not mostly the truth. not mostly the true picture of the forests. Typically, rainforests are quite dynamic. Their annual mortality, when we talk about mature trees, that means technically, let's say trees at least deviate 10 centimeters. Then there is annual mortality between 0.5 and let's say 2.7 or maybe 3%. Okay, it might seem low numbers, but you have to think that if you have 1% mortality, that means that average lifespan of such a tree is 100 years. Yeah, that's basically a reciprocal value of the percentage mortality. If you have 2% mortality, that's only 50 years. So average tree will only last 50 years. So that's pretty dynamic system. These are all the mortality values I was able to put together for different forests. And as you can see, these New Guinea forests, this actually you are looking exactly at the so far highest dynamics recorded ever in the tropics. This is the mountain central range area of New Guinea, and that has 2.7% of mortality. So typical lifespan of tree is actually more like 35 years. So these dynamics can be important, and there has been an interesting analysis which look at these dynamics, percentage mortality per year for different forests. So every point here is a different forest ecosystem from different regions based on the markers. And this is the diversity of these forests as number of species per 500 stems. And you can see that there is a quite nice correlation. So the higher dynamics means higher diversity, and probably it's because of really keeping the forest very diverse, removing any dominant trees. Of course, this is not selective. It's not a density dependent process disturbance. It's actually textbook density independent one, but it still can work as diversifying factor. Now, again, we have, as in the past, when we were looking at specific leaf area, we looked at the mean value for certain environments, and then we also looked at variance, at variability in each environment. These are actually two very useful approaches you can always take whatever you study. Look whether there are differences in mean or whether there are differences in variance. And so again, we can go here, look at the the annual mortality, and also in this case on relative growth, that relative growth rate, and we can look at different again 50-hectare forest plots. BCI is our well-known Barro Colorado island here, and then you already saw some examples from Paso, Yasuni, and then this is Hong Kong, where the plot is smaller, as you can expect. And so you can look at the mean mortality between these forests. That's what the previous analysis did. But you can also look at the variance, and you can see big differences. Yeah, you can see Hong Kong is much more variable, and to some extent Barro Colorado as well than Yasuni or Paso. And then the hypothesis goes like that. Okay, if you have a bigger variability in demographics parameters like mortality and growth, then that can also be good for diversification of the forest, because simply, we may not know exact mechanisms why low mortality and high mortality trees might better coexist than if everybody has the same mortality, but it's a fair possibility. And so they were exploring this option, but in this case, unfortunately, they found that there is no relationship. This is the result: number of species in that forest against again the demographic range. So that means the minimum maximum for either mortality or growth, and you would expect a relationship. You don't see any. Okay, now let's go to look at, we were talking about disturbance, which is basically creating a spatial heterogeneity. Now we can look at changes over time, which might reverse the direction of competition between species. Okay, we will use one nice example, and that is El Nino. You remember from the first lecture, and Panama is a nice study system. This is the entire breadth of the country. On the Pacific coast, there is Panama City, and then you go basically following the Panama Canal all the way to the Atlantic side, and that represents a gradient in rainfall from relatively dry Pacific side all the way to wet Atlantic, but also in the effects of El Nino, because El Nino is, as you remember, a Pacific phenomenon. So this study looks at the effect of a recent large El Nino event, 2015-16. So this is the reminder of the El Nino strength graph, so that we are here. And what they did is they had a number of plots along this gradient, and they were looking at what was the change in mortality rate of trees during El Nino. Okay, there is no surprise that when you have very strong El Nino, trees are dying more than if you have a normal year. So that was not the point of the study here. That was sort of taken for granted. But they were looking at how much this mortality increased at different plots, and they related these plots according to the typical severity of dry season in normal years. And so this is the rainfall deficit in the dry season as opposed to wet season. So the bigger it is, the stronger dry season, and that's x-axis. And on y-axis is the change in mortality with El Nino. And you can see that the forests which are already used to strong dry season, even in El Nino, nothing happens there. Yeah, there is basically no change in mortality. While those, perhaps not surprisingly, those forests with mild dry season, when the El Nino strikes, then they are in real problems, and the trees there are in real problems. Okay, that's just difference between habitats, so that doesn't tell us much about coexistence. But then they were also looking at individual tree species and how they were behaving, and every tree species was characterized by drought sensitivity, and that was measured experimentally. They were looking at survival difference between seedlings in dry conditions versus irrigated conditions. So they experimentally, independently from weather, defined drought sensitivity, and then looked at how the annual mortality rate of species changed with El Nino against other years. And you see very nice result here that, of course, again, the tough species which are used to dry conditions, nothing changed during El Nino year, but the more accustomed you are to wet season, the faster you die. And so that means when El Nino comes. And so that means that when El Nino comes, then different species suddenly are surviving better, and different species are dying faster than in normal years. And that is exactly what can slow down exclusion of species by competition. Because remember that such a strong El Nino comes at least once, probably several times in the lifetime of every tree. Yeah, it comes every 20 years, more or less. Okay, let's go to another one mechanism, which is immigration prevents competitive exclusion. Again, that's pretty, there is not much to be said about it. We know that if there is a lot of immigration, it tends to swamp the local dynamics, the local interactions, and so that's sort of intuitively clear concept. I will just show some modeling. These are just models. These are not real forests. They are looking at situation with zero immigration and different increasing immigration rates. And these are species area curves. Yeah, so with increasing forest area, number of species increases, and different colors are different strengths of conspecific negative density dependency. So this is not between species competition. This is again back to what you already know, conspecific negative density dependency, but the principle is the same. So the orange one is no CNDD, and so it always competition always comes to ends up with a single species, because the species are simply not regulated. So whichever species is best adapted then will win and will establish a plantation basically. That of course is regulated by increasingly strong CNDD, but then you can see that even with no CNDD under migration, either immigration, you already get this strong competition exclusion working less efficiently, and that intensifies. And finally, with very strong immigration, even conspecific density dependency doesn't really matter. All the different functions sort of congeal into the same species area curve, which is purely defined by immigration. Okay, also example which is sort of a little bit different. This is the effect of this is the importance of conspecific negative density dependency on species richness for different immigration rates. So here different colors are different immigration rates. The violet ones are the highest one, and the orange ones is 0. And you have this effect size. That's basically the importance of CNDD. And so if you have no immigration, then there is an importance of CNDD. Basically, okay, sorry. There are two systems. One with weak CNDD, and the second one is with the stronger effect of conspecific negative density dependency. And again, you are looking at the effect size of CNDD with area here, and then that effect basically only exists when you have zero immigration rate. And again, with increasing migration rate, you basically again come to a flat violet curve, which means that CNDD is completely wiped out in face of immigration. Okay, finally, one mention, you can come across so-called neutral theory of biodiversity, that which was published in a book, again by Steve Hubble. We already know him, and that is basically a theory where you start with a very implausible assumption, and that is that all species are ecologically identical. Yeah, they are not different. Of course, this is also basically null hypothesis, which serves to develop expectations under that assumption and then confront them with the reality. And so it's a spatially explicit model. So basically you have actually real positions of individual trees in your model, and you start with some kind of initial diversity, and then you model depth of individual trees, and then each individual tree is replaced under certain conditions, but choosing randomly irrespective of which species it is, because as we said, the species are ecologically identical. So there is no reason to select one, or for instance, that one is not better disperser or better colonizer of empty space. No, they are completely the same. And so you choose either lottery effect, a lottery selection of the tree, or you have immigration, and select an immigrating species, which can be completely new species. There is another version of the model where instead of immigration, you have speciation. So that's sort of evolutionary one. And this theory is interesting by the fact that it actually, that's very simple model under reasonable parameters can actually simulate a lots of structural features of the forests. But at the same time, you know, it doesn't go very far, because if you start with the assumption of all the species behave the same, that, you know, finally you find differences from that assumption, and that's not a big surprise. So there used to be some controversy about it. It's an interesting exercise to see what can be sort of artifacts of basic behavior, like shown in this picture, and what is more complicated. But otherwise, I am not really extremely impressed by this, unlike some other people. I think the 50-hectare plot is better achievement of Steve Hubble than the neutral theory of biodiversity. Okay, and then we have also the last one, and that is the species do not have opportunity to compete. Okay, how that can happen? Well, it's basically, you know, if you have a duel, you know, if two people want to fight, then, you know, you set up the place and time for the duel, and if you don't show up, then, you know, there is no defeat and no victory. And so that's exactly what many trees are doing in many places in the forest. That there is so-called dispersal limitation, which is sort of common sense situation where not all the tree species are dispersing to all places. And so that means that every specific place in the forest has a limited subset of trees which are actually competing for space there. That's a common sense, but what is important is that with forests so diverse as we have in the tropics, this can be actually very important factor, because if you have 500 species in one forest, then a certain pair of two rare species may almost never actually come together. So which one is competitively superior is basically moot. You know, it's completely irrelevant, because it actually never happened in reality. Okay, how you measure this? Well, you are using seed traps. This is one from Vanang. But this example actually comes from Barro Colorado Island, and they put 200 seed traps like that there, and they were monitoring them for 10 years. And this project can get very boring, because of course you can monitor your seed trap, but then you also have to identify every single seed to species, and that's a big problem. That's why you can't do this kind of research almost anywhere in the tropics, because you need to know species of all trees which are growing there, and these can be hundreds of species. Barro Colorado Island, they do have that knowledge, and the study we are going to talk about have in acknowledgement. There is a charming sentence. We also thank O. Calderon for counting and identifying more than 1 million seeds over the years. Yeah, I would probably not like to have that job, but it's a special knowledge which allowed them to actually look at what is the dispersal limitation in the forest. So this is the number of species per trap. So this is the distribution. We have 200 traps, and then very few of them had no. Actually, all of them had at least some seeds. Yeah, and then the most of them, 53 different traps, had around 25. This is, as you see, scaled by 5 species, had around 25 species, and then extremes were 55. So even the most species-rich trap only have 55 species out of 260, which are potential species pool. So you already have only 20% of species from the forest potentially competing in one place, and that's the extreme. This is different way of expressing the result. This is actually looking at 3 species and in how many seed traps they were found. And you can see that very few species were found in almost all traps. these are certainly not suffering dispersal limitation. They are really everywhere. But that was only few species. And then the proportion drops fast. And then when you look at how many species are in 25% of all the traps, it's only 50 of them. So again, we are down to 20% of species. And then there is a huge tail of species which were only in one trap or none at all. And so that means that they are really severely limited in dispersal. This is an example of, again, the most common species in the plot, which is understory shrub Trichilia tuberculata. And this is the performance of Trichilia. This is the number of seeds per square meter. There is a seasonality, and you can see that there is some kind of production every year, and then, which happens to be at El Nino year, 1997, strong El Nino, the production shoots 4 or 5 times normal situation, then gets back again. Okay, and these are the consequences. Yeah, this is again graph for Trichinella, but for seedlings. And the black one are the percentage of seed traps receiving at least one seed. So in the 97 years, it was not quite 100% of traps, but still high. And then you look at the seedlings there in these places. And so red are the percentage of seedling plots with at least one seedling of any age present. So we don't care if it arrived the same year as we do measurement, or it is there from the past. The main thing it's there. And you can see that there was about 25–30% of such places, and then it jumped to 75 after this very good year and stayed there. Mortality was low of these seedlings. And that's because of the light green, where this is the seedlings established the given year. There is a huge jump which corresponds to production. So again, this is a bit frustrating for, if you send a PhD student to study Trichilia, and the study starts in 1994, then basically you have 3 years and you think you know how the system behaves, pretty much the same seed production. You completely miss this huge peak, and then you miss the production of new seedlings. That's why it's good to combine this kind of dynamic study like seed production, which can be very different every year, with the vegetation structure, because the signature of surviving seedlings are there even after that unusual year happened. So if somebody comes in 98, then there is clearly a signature that something happened compared to 96. Yeah. Okay, so again, these interactions between species, we go again to our favorite 20 times 20 meter plot, which you already saw so many times from Wanang. Again, 220 stems, 85 species. And we look at, first, if we have 85 species, then from 536 species in the big plot, it's only 16%. So this is relevant because in trees, lots of competition is short distance. And then when you look at the 85 species there, then that represents 3,570 different pairwise interspecific interactions. So, if species can influence each other across the whole 20 times 20 meter plot, then you can have 3,500 of these interactions between specific pairs of species, which is a lot, but it's only 2.5% of 143,380 such different interactions which exist between 536 species in the larger plot. So again, at every place, only very small percentage of possible interactions is taking place. When we look at the most common species in that 20 times 20 meter plot, which is represented by 13 individuals. They are here as the squares. It's actually pretty aggregated, unusually so. That's maybe why it's most common here, that it somehow happens to create this cluster. But when we look for each individual, what is the nearest neighbor, so that means the neighbor with potentially strongest interaction, then in 4 cases, that's another conspecific tree. And then in other cases, there are 9 other species. Yeah, so it's 4 times the same species, and then 2 times Cryptocarya, 2 times Monintoa, 2 times Phytosporum, and then single interactions. So for aphonomics here, it's absolutely irrelevant that there are 536 species in the forest. What only matters are these nine species. It matters its own species, of course, and then it matters that there are 9 other species, which are the nearest neighbors and therefore potentially the biggest competitors, nothing else. Okay, so we are getting close to the finish of the lecture. So a little summary. First, as I said, no single theory is all explanatory, but it really looks like the Jensen-Connell is sort of pervasive mechanisms which shapes the tropical forests, not solely, but to a large degree. Then we have, and this is already my opinion, this is no really solid conclusion, that the next one will be these 3 mechanisms which are somehow preventing competition from happening. So it's either mass effect, migration, insufficient time for competitive exclusion, and recruitment limitation. The insufficient time happens because of all these lack of pairwise comparisons. And then finally, the classical niche theory comes last. And there are 2 effects. One is the division along the gradient, and second is the variability over time of space, which is changing the direction of the competition. Okay, so that's the end. Thank you for your attention, and we can have questions.